Hello everyone. Tonight I bring you a story that drifts between myth and reality. A tale whispered in hushed tones by those who dare to remember it. They say there exists a village where time itself refuses to move forward. A place lost in the folds of forgotten maps, hidden deep within an old forest where no one lingers after sunset. The story of this village has haunted travelers, historians, and storytellers for centuries, but few have tried to uncover the truth. This is the story of the abandoned village where time stands still. The journey begins with a man named Arman, a young historian obsessed with places that history tried to erase. He first came across the name of the village in a decaying manuscript he found in an antique store tucked away in the alleys of a crowded city. The manuscript was written in broken script, half of it eaten away by mold, yet one phrase stood out. Where the clocks do not move, the people do not breathe, and the shadows walk alone. These words gnawed at his curiosity, dragging him into the mystery he would never escape from. At first, Arman thought it was just folklore, an old tale meant to frighten children or keep strangers away. But then he found scattered references in different sources, an old newspaper article from the 1920s about a missing expedition, a priest's diary entry from the 1008, hundreds that mentioned a cursed settlement, and even a modern blog where a hiker swore he stumbled across ruins where his watch stopped working. The consistency of these whispers across time made Arman believe there was more than coincidence. There was a truth hidden in plain sight, and he wanted to be the one to uncover it. After months of preparation, Arman set out on his journey. The directions to the village were vague, written like riddles. Follow the river until it forgets its path, one passage said. Another instructed, when the wind carries no sound, the village is near. With only his notebook, a lantern, and his stubborn determination, Arman entered the forest that was said to swallow travelers whole. The forest was unlike any other. The trees stood impossibly tall, their branches intertwining like ancient guardians hiding secrets. The air was heavy, damp, and unsettlingly quiet. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. The silence was alive, pressing against Arman's chest with every step. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, but the deeper he walked, the more unnatural it felt. It was on the third day of his journey that Arman first noticed the strange phenomenon. His wristwatch, a reliable companion for years, had stopped ticking. At first, he thought the battery had died, but then he realized his phone too refused to display the correct time. Both devices froze at exactly 3:15, even though he had walked for hours afterward. He tried to shake it off, but unease crept into his mind like smoke. By nightfall, he discovered ruins scattered between the roots of ancient trees, broken pottery, collapsed wooden beams, fragments of walls covered in moss. He realized he had stumbled into the edge of the village. It was eerily intact for a place abandoned for so long, as if the people had vanished suddenly and time had stopped preserving the moment. Chairs sat overturned around long, rotted tables, doors creaked open as though waiting for their owners, and lanterns hung unbroken, their glass fogged but not shattered. It felt like walking into a memory frozen in place. Arman set up camp in what appeared to be the village square. A dried-up fountain stood at the center, its stone cracked but still holding the faint carving of a sun at its base. He sat there staring at the carving, feeling as though the stone itself was staring back. As he wrote his notes by lantern light, he realized the flame barely flickered. The air was still, too still. It was as though the wind itself refused to cross into the village. That night, as he tried to sleep, Arman heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and echoing across the empty streets. His heart raced, but when he looked out from his tent, the square was empty. Shadows stretched unnaturally long beneath the moonlight, bending in ways that made no sense. He whispered to himself that it was just fatigue, just nerves, yet deep down, he knew he was not alone. The following morning, Arman explored deeper. He found houses with belongings still inside, clothes folded neatly in wooden chests, tools leaning against walls, and even a child's toy resting by a doorframe. But there were no signs of people, no graves, no bones, no explanation for why an entire community had vanished without a trace. The strangest thing, however, was that every single clock he found, On walls, on tables, even pocket watches, was frozen at exactly 3:15. The deeper he went, the more bizarre the village became. In one house, he discovered food that looked as though it had just been cooked, though it crumbled to ash when touched. In another, he found a mirror so clean it reflected his face with unnerving clarity, though the house was covered in layers of dust. In the old church at the far end of the village, he saw candles standing tall, their wax untouched by fire, as if they had been waiting centuries for someone to light them. But the most unsettling discovery came when he reached the edge of the village again. The path he had taken to enter was gone, no footprints, no broken branches, just dense trees closing in like a wall. The forest had rearranged itself, trapping him within. Arman tried to remain calm, telling himself he would find another way out. Yet with every hour that passed, the same oppressive stillness pressed against him. His stomach knotted, and he realized something terrifying. He had not felt hunger or thirst since arriving in the village. He had not grown tired, his muscles did not ache, and his lantern's flame did not burn down. It was as though his body too had been caught in the web of this frozen time. That night, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like wind seeping through cracks in walls. Then they grew clearer, forming words in a language Arman did not recognize. The voices came from the empty houses, from the fountain, from the ground beneath his feet. He covered his ears, but the whispers grew louder inside his head. He shouted for them to stop, and suddenly they did. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. He wanted to leave, but there was nowhere to go. The village seemed to shift, streets rearranging themselves, houses moving slightly when he wasn't looking. He would turn a corner only to find himself back in the square, the dried fountain watching him with its unblinking carved sun. It was like a maze designed to break his spirit. On the fifth day, or what he thought was the fifth day, since time meant nothing, there Arman discovered the diary. It was inside the church, tucked beneath the altar. The leather was cracked, but the ink inside was startlingly fresh, as though it had been written only yesterday. The diary belonged to a man named Elias, one of the last known villagers. The entries described how the village had prospered once, living in harmony with the forest. But then, a stranger had arrived. The man carried with him a clock, unlike any other, golden and intricate, its ticking echoing like thunder. He gifted it to the villagers, claiming it would bless them with endless prosperity. For a time it seemed true. Crops flourished, illnesses vanished, and no one aged. But soon the blessing revealed itself as a curse. Time stopped moving. The villagers could not grow, could not change, could not leave. Days blurred into eternity, and madness spread like disease. Some tried to destroy the golden clock, but every attempt failed. The final entry in the diary read, "The clock has chosen. We are its prisoners. If anyone finds this place, do not trust the silence. It is alive." Arman closed the diary, his hands trembling. For the first time, fear overtook his curiosity. He knew then that the whispers, the shadows, the frozen time, it was all connected to the cursed clock. And if it was still here, then he too was now part of its web. That night he dreamt of the golden clock. It stood in the middle of the square, its hands frozen at 3:15, but its ticking shook the air like a heartbeat. He saw figures moving around it, villagers with hollow eyes, their bodies rigid like statues, yet somehow alive. They stared at him, their mouths opening in silent screams. When he awoke, his lantern was out, yet the square glowed faintly, as though something unseen pulsed beneath the ground. Arman's story was only beginning. What he did not know was that the curse of the golden clock had been waiting for someone new, and now it had chosen him. Arman woke to the same silence, the kind that pressed into his ears until he could hear nothing but the pounding of his own heartbeat. He rubbed his eyes and looked around the square. The fountain, the houses, the church, it was all the same, yet somehow it felt different, heavier, as though the village itself had grown aware of his presence. He remembered the diary he had read the night before. The words etched themselves into his mind. The clock has chosen. We are its prisoners. If that were true, then he too was caught in the curse, destined to remain here until madness consumed him. But Arman refused to accept that fate. He was a historian, a seeker of truth. If this place was cursed, then there had to be a reason, and a way out. He decided to search for the golden clock. For hours, or what felt like hours, he scoured the village. He went into every house, every shed, every dark cellar. He found objects that didn't make sense. A loaf of bread still warm yet crumbling into dust. A painting where the eyes seemed to follow him. A chair that rocked gently, as though someone had just stood up from it. But no clock. When he reached the church again, he felt the air shift. The silence deepened, becoming so dense that even his footsteps seemed muffled. He pushed open the heavy wooden door, and it groaned like an animal in pain. Inside, the pews were coated in dust, yet they looked untouched, as though they had been waiting for centuries. At the altar, the faint glow he had seen in his dream pulsed again, a heartbeat in the shadows. There it was. The golden clock sat on a pedestal carved from stone, its surface gleaming as though freshly polished. Its hands were frozen at 3:15, yet it ticked, low, deliberate, a sound that echoed through the church like a hammer striking metal. Arman felt his body freeze as he stared at it. The air around the clock seemed to ripple, bending the light, distorting the very space it occupied. He wanted to smash it, to end the nightmare, but as he stepped forward, the whispers began again. They weren't faint this time. They were sharp, insistent, filling his head with words that weren't his own. He stumbled, clutching his skull as the voices grew louder. They weren't speaking to each other. They were speaking to him. Stay, belong, you are chosen. Arman fell to his knees, the weight of the voices crushing his mind. His vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he saw figures moving in the pews. The villagers. Silent, unmoving, their eyes locked on him. They weren't gone. They were here, forever frozen, prisoners of the clock. And now they wanted him to join them. Summoning all his strength, Arman stumbled out of the church. The whispers followed him into the square, echoing through the empty streets. He pressed his hands over his ears, but it was no use. The village was alive now, every stone, every shadow pulsing with the rhythm of the clock. He ran, but the village twisted around him, reshaping itself. No matter which street he took, he found himself back at the fountain, the carved sun glaring up at him with its unblinking stare. His breaths came in ragged gasps, though he realized he wasn't truly out of breath. His body was caught in the same stasis as everything else. The fear was in his mind, and the clock fed on it. Desperate, Arman tried to burn one of the houses. He gathered wood, lit a match, and set the dry beams aflame. For a moment, fire roared to life, crackling and consuming. But then, in the blink of an eye, it vanished, leaving the house untouched, as though the flame had been erased from existence. The village did not allow destruction. It did not allow change. That night he dreamed again. The villagers stood around him, their mouths open in silent screams, their hands reaching out. In the center, the golden clock loomed taller than any building, its ticking shaking the earth. When he woke, he was no longer in the square. He was inside one of the houses, lying in a bed he had never seen before. The whispers told him this was his home now. Days blurred together. Arman could no longer tell how long he had been in the village. He wrote in his notebook, but even the ink never seemed to dry, as though the words themselves resisted permanence. He shouted into the empty streets, but only silence replied. Sometimes he thought he saw movement in the corners of his eyes, a child's laughter, a figure vanishing behind a door, shadows bending into shapes that resembled people. The diary had warned him, do not trust the silence. It is alive, he understood now. The silence wasn't absence. It was presence. The village itself was watching him, testing him, waiting for him to surrender. But Arman refused. He returned to the church, determined to face the clock. This time he did not hesitate. He approached the pedestal, ignoring the whispers that clawed at his mind, and laid his hands on the golden clock. The moment he touched it, the world shattered. He was no longer in the church. He was standing in the square, but it was alive again. The villagers were there, bustling, laughing, living. The fountain flowed with water, the market was full of voices, children ran through the streets. Time was moving. A woman approached him, her eyes kind but strange. "You're new," she said, smiling. "Welcome." Arman looked around in awe, but then he noticed something terrifying. Every villager wore the same expression. Their smiles never faltered, their eyes never blinked. It was a loop, a memory replaying itself endlessly. He reached out to one of them, and his hand passed through as though they were smoke. The illusion cracked, and he was back in the church, clutching the golden clock. The whispers screamed in rage, shaking the walls, but Arman held on tighter. He realized then that the clock fed on fear, on submission. It wanted him to believe he was trapped, to surrender to its curse. "No," he whispered through gritted teeth, "you won't have me." With every ounce of strength he pulled at the clock's hands. They resisted, unmoving, but he pushed harder. The whispers grew deafening, promising him peace if he gave up, torment if he resisted. His vision darkened, his body shook, but he did not stop. With one final cry, he forced the hands to move. The moment they shifted past 3:15, the ticking stopped. Silence, true silence, not the heavy, living silence of the village, but the kind that comes when a storm ends. The whispers were gone, the shadows stilled, the clock no longer glowed. Arman collapsed to the floor, gasping for air he hadn't realized he was holding. He opened his eyes and saw light pouring through the church windows. Real sunlight. For the first time since he had arrived, time had moved forward. He staggered outside and found the village crumbling around him. The houses decayed into dust, the fountain shattered, the church collapsed. The illusion shattered, and the truth revealed itself. This place had been dead for centuries. Only the clock had kept it alive, feeding on anyone who wandered in. As the last stones fell, Arman stumbled into the forest. The path was open again, the trees no longer closing in. He looked back once, and saw nothing but an empty clearing where the village had been. No trace of the curse remained. He walked for hours until he reached the edge of the forest, where the world felt normal again. Birds sang, wind rustled through the leaves, and his watch ticked forward. He laughed, a broken, weary laugh, as tears stung his eyes. He was free, but freedom came with a cost. When he returned to the city, Arman tried to tell his story, but no one believed him. They said he had been lost, that he had imagined it all. Yet in the quiet of his study, when he opened his notebook, he found words he had never written. The clock has chosen. It is not finished. And sometimes late at night he swore he could hear it. The faint, steady ticking of a golden clock waiting for him to return. Because curses don't die, they wait.